Celebrations now, come on. Why am I so happy? Why could I be so happy? Well, I'll tell you why. It's because my book, The Gallipoli Evacuation, is now available to buy. Hooray! Forget all that and pre-ordering, forget all that. You can actually buy it. You can buy it all over the world through the wonders of the internet. You can pay in a wide range of currencies, and all you have to do is go to our website, which is livinghistoryytv.com. livinghistoryytv.com. You know it makes sense. Buy today.
A Living History production.
I'm Peter Hart, and for the last 40 years I've interviewed thousands of veterans about their experience of war. Join me on a journey through the pages of history. Welcome to Peter Hart's Military History. Hello and welcome to Peter Hart's Military History Podcast. I'm here with Gary Bain. Dun, dun, dun.
Hello.
That was a big... I thought you were going to say something interesting. Mind you, you never do. This is... We're here to... What are we talking about today, Gary, just to get you back in a good mood?
Well, today, Peter, it's the third in the series about the South Notts Hussars' experiences in Tobruk. And today we're talking about the Breakout. We've already talked about the retreat to Tobruk and conditions, and now we're talking about breaking out. And...
what we tried to get across to people last time was we know what happened at Tobruk, but if you were part of the Tobruk garrison, if you were a South Notts Hussar gunner on your gun, you didn't know you were going to get out. You didn't know whether the Germans were going to break in and have you for breakfast, so to speak, or you just did. Sorry, about 8 euphemisms came to my mind there, and probably 10 to your mind from the look on your face. They didn't know what was going to happen, and also for them that was the war. But it's bigger than that, isn't it, Gary? Tobruk, northwest, the Western Desert. That's not the whole war, is it?
No, and I think as events during that year demonstrate, for example, the invasion of the USSR, it's arguably a sideshow right from the start. But for the guys on the ground, that's their war.
Because so once when does that start? June 1941, they invade the Soviet Union, and I think most people now would accept that then the great questions of the war against Germany would be answered not in North Africa, but on the Eastern Front, and I think they were. But that, nevertheless, for Britain, and we've always been a remarkably selfish country, North Africa is absolutely crucial, and that's because of the Suez Canal, the links to the east, to India, to the rest of the empire as it was then, and so it's still a big priority for the British Empire. And they had a new Middle East Commander-in-Chief, and this is one of my favourites. Why do I always like people who are not particularly popular? Well, General Sir Claude Auchinleck, who lived until about 1980-something.
The Hawk, was it?
The Orc.
The Orc.
Not the Hawk. No, Orc.
Orc.
I think they brilliantly, in the British nickname tradition, took a bit of his surname.
Oh, could have been called Leck then.
He could have been called Lecky Leck, yeah. So this is the new man in charge of kicking out Rommel from hurling him back anyway. Now, Auchinleck is I think he's an excellent general, and he assesses the situation. By his judgment, that he hasn't got enough forces under his command, and they're too weak, they're not experienced, and he doesn't think he can make an immediate successful attack. So he demands more reinforcements, and he also demands time to train them under desert conditions. Now, this is all very sensible, but there is one great sort of huge cloud that is above any practical general in the Second World War. Who's that?
Well, I'm assuming you're referring to Churchill, who I would imagine just agreed magnanimously immediately to the suggestion.
Now, there's a furious row. Churchill wanted an immediate offensive, and Auchinleck was pragmatic, and he stood his ground. He was always willing to stand up to Churchill. And he set a date for the offensive that would relieve Tobruk, and he set it for November, early November by preference, but it'll end up mid to late. By August 41, there's only 3 Italian and 1 German division around Tobruk. The rest were up on the Egyptian border, and both sides. At Tobruk, nothing much is happening. There's just little tiny attacks. There's what we call, trying to gain a tactical advantage. Just a small, little tiny bits and bobs going on. Nothing much is happening. The South Notts Hussars move from their central position over to the east, where they will support the infantry in that sector. So as you look at a map of Tobruk, it's on the right-hand side, which is a lot easier for me to remember than east and west, because I'm a half-wit. The garrison is changing. It changes a lot. This is partly because of politics. The Australian government and senior command were insistent that Australian formations should fight together on a single front. Deployed,
a bit like the Americans in the First War.
And it's a natural reaction. I don't, people criticise them for this, but I don't think this is such a terrible thing. And Churchill sees that this is he bends here with the wind, and the 9th Australian Division, which had been the bulk of the garrison, were withdrawn and replaced by the 70th Division, commanded by Major General Robert Scobie, who therefore took over from General Morshead in overall charge of the Tobruk garrison.
Why not give Tobruk up and just fall back on Mersa Matruh?
Because Tobruk is a major port. It lies as a position. This is a technical term that you'll know from your army day. It's an embuggerance. It lies threatening their lines of communication because they're further up the desert. They're further to the east on the Egyptian border. It's just a bloody nuisance to them, and. So that's why they weren't going to just pull out. Also, pulling out would have been difficult. They'd have needed an evacuation of Gallipoli style.
I see what you've done there.
Buy your copy today. But it's a fantastic achievement by the Royal Navy because 47,000 of the garrison are evacuated and replaced. 34,000 come in. And who do we pay tribute to here? And indeed, who had fed, watered and everything else the garrison during the siege? Who do we pay tribute to?
Transport for London.
Yes, in a way, yes, Gary.
The Royal Navy. I get the two confused.
Yeah, they are easily confused if you're...
Very similar uniforms.
What? Now these replacements, they are fresher troops. Of course, they've not been in a 6-month siege, and the Tobruk artillery is reinforced by a couple of. There's 144 field artillery and 149 anti-tank, both Royal Artillery. Now, there's a great story about this that I love because there's a Polish brigade comes in and. As part, there's many reinforcements, and here's a great story from Sergeant Jack Sykes, who is this story true? Well, have a listen to it and see what you think. It's a great story. Gary, you're going to be Sergeant Jack Sykes of the South Notts Hussars. Tell us all, Gary.
Yeah, so basically what we're suggesting is that you would expect that it was going to be the Polish soldiers that they had most difficulty in understanding, and Jack Sykes says, we were repairing this wire and these blokes came over the cliff and I could hear them talking and I thought, Christ, I couldn't understand them, hardly. And I thought, they're bloody Germans. It frightened the life out of me. Turned out they were Durham Light Infantry. You know how they talk. "Wee, hey, lad," and all that.
"Wee, hey, lad." Your body, lad.
Yum, yum.
I'd like to dedicate that to Mark Jackson.
Who's probably the only person who could understand me.
Yeah. The accents were much stronger in those days, and people couldn't understand people from other parts of the country. It's a great story. Is it true? Yeah, it's apocryphal, isn't it? It's a great story to illustrate the point, rather than something you wouldn't put yourself in line to defend that it's absolutely true.
And I didn't know that the Durham Light Infantry recruited in Poland.
Well, the 1st Battalion of Regulars, they'll recruit anywhere. Now, Auchinleck is still aware that Churchill wants Tobruk to be relieved, and as he gets ready, he forms an 8th Army. This is the start of the 8th Army, always linked to Montgomery, of course, but at this point, 8th Army is created by Auchinleck and under the command of General Alan Cunningham. And they pick a date for the offensive, 18th of November. And ironically, ironically is a great word, this is just as Rommel was also planning an offensive. So that's quite interesting. Cunningham's forces, 30th Corps, which are 7th Armoured Division, 1st South African, and then 13th Corps, which is a New Zealand division, and the 4th Indian Division, and the 1st Army Tank Brigade. I think what I would notice here is this is an imperial effort or Commonwealth effort, whichever one it was at the time. I'm slightly vague on that. This is not just the British Army. This is a Commonwealth effort.
And they're advancing from Egypt.
From the Egyptian border, that's the plan. This is going to be called Operation Crusader. It's a massive offensive by British standards. It's to force the Axis forces, Rommel's forces, away from the Suez Canal, clear the threat from Egypt. First, they destroy the Axis forces in eastern Cyrenaica. There'll be a map up somewhere for you to see this, and then push on to occupy Tripolitania. Tripolitania. So on the 18th of November, the 13th Corps would attack Sidi Omar, looking to push north behind the German defensive lines, while the 30th Corps would push round Rommel's southern flank. This is the classic sweep into the desert.
Yeah, and I believe that the plan envisaged the Desert Air Force providing 2 clear days without any serious opposition in the air, but I believe the weather the night before was atrocious. It was torrential rain and storms, so that there was no opportunity for the Desert Air Force to interdict any of the airfields and destroy the aircraft on the ground, which was part of the original plan.
So the weather again impedes British plans on that. So this is a sort of class. So there's a pinning attack by the 13th Corps. Well, they're going to attack straight on, and there's the usual. And in the desert, there's always an open flank because you can't have trenches right across the Sahara. So there's an open flank. And they're going to sweep round there, and they're meant to try and take on the German armoured forces in the Gabriel Salah sector, which. And at the same time, and this is where we come to the main part of our story, the Tobruk garrison was to punch out and capture Sidi Rezaiq and the El Douda ridges, which lay southeast of Tobruk. Does that make sense? So this is going from both angles. So there's a punch straight, there's a hook to the left, and then from the other side, the Tobruk garrison are going to come out to meet them on El Douda ridge is there. Do-da day, do-da dum do do. Don't know why. I said I was easily distracted. El Douda Ridge. Now, the South Notts Hussars would cover the attack launched by 70th Division. This is and they'd push out to El Douda Ridge was about 11 miles away. So this is quite a major offensive. 11 miles isn't next to it, is it? Where they were supposed to rendezvous with the tanks of 30th Corps who'd done the left hook. You used to box, didn't you, Gary?
Yes, Pete. You're doing a fantastic impression of a left hook with your right hand.
Oh. That's my left hand.
That one's not.
Oh, no. I was doing it with both. Right. So now there's intensive briefings. Robert Scobie was one of these generals who liked to brief everyone. So they had all the officers and senior NCOs in. Well, all the officers in. Then the NCOs, everybody was briefed.
Yeah, but it was about the specifics, wasn't it? About their specific part, not the overall.
Oh, no. Their part within the greater scheme of things. And do you think every man took note of their part within the scheme of things? You know, people like yourself, Gary?
Absolutely. They'd have scribbled it down on a scrap of paper.
And then what would they have used?
Eaten the paper.
No, I thought you were going to say something else. Right. In brief, 425 Battery would support the advance of the 32nd Armoured Brigade and the 2nd Black Watch, a fine body of men. I'd like to pay tribute to all our Scottish fans who are Legion, I understand. Legion.
Okay.
Okay, the new... Oh, I speak the Scottish, like a native of Spain. The second Black Watch would zoop out and get the strong point Tiger. Again, hope to have maps up of this. Meanwhile, 426 Battery, they'd fire their first barrage from actually outside the minefield. So they'd go into no man's land, fire their first barrage, and they're supported attack by the 1st Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire Regiment and the 1st Royal Tank Regiment on the Jack strong point. These are lovely imaginative names, Jack, Jill, things like that. So they're covered by night. The gunners dig new gun positions, and they move forward absolutely bloody thousands of shells. And they camouflage everything up. They get the telephone cables out, and they prepare. Wireless is not good sometimes in the desert, so they want to send a telephone laying machine thing out with them. What would that call? And a Bren carrier. The Bren carrier would have the OP team, the observation post team, and they'd also have a telephone line laying lorry. Now, lorries are not terribly well built for being out in at the sharp end. And this is Lance Sergeant Dennis Middleton, and he said this: "We had to prepare Bombardier Keaton's vehicle, which was his soft-skinned 1500 weight, which was fortified with sandbags. It was piled with sandbags inside all round, leaving a small space in the centre on which we mounted a windlass for a reel of cable. The truck was going to go forward with the tanks, immediately behind the Black Watch, reeling out the cable behind it. Stan Keaton was given this enviable task. Peter Birkin would be in his Bren carrier with Ted Whittaker manning the radio." Now, the news came that on the 20th, they were going to attack next day. And at 4 o'clock in the morning, the 21st of 1941, there was a diversionary attack, but the real attack commenced at 6 o'clock that morning. And the officers had been preparing their detailed fire programs for their guns. And this sounds boring, but actually, do you know what? A barrage has no impact at all unless this boring, mind-boggling stuff is there. And you've been chosen to read this boring, mind-boggling detail.
This is Lance Sergeant George Pearson.
One of our favourites.
A predicted barrage is where you draw on the map where you want the barrage to fall. If it moves forward 100 yards every 3 minutes, you draw each line of the barrage on the map. Each gun sergeant then gets a gun programme that says every 3 minutes he's got to add 100 yards and go right or left so many degrees. Of course, they had to be accurate because your infantry were moving up to within 200 yards of the line's shells. If you dropped shells on your own infantry, you weren't very popular.
Of course, that's always the accusation by the infantry. Ah, bloody gunners. The gunners will always say, well, no, that was shells from the Germans. Yeah, funny they were coming from our side of the lines. Anyway, now, the plan was first, and you'll enjoy these names. What's the first fire target that they had?
Butch.
Fire target Butch. They'd fire on that for 8 minutes. That would cover the advance of 16th Brigade and cover the left flank of the main advance. They then switched to fire for 10 minutes on the heavily mined
Jill
Ridge. Then the main barrage would fall on the 2 main strong points.
Tiger and Jack.
You forgot that, didn't you?
Well, I was trying to think, if I've just gone for Tiger, what do I do for Jack?
And then they'd switch to a counter-battery role. Now, Bob Folds, he remembered how fast the firing was, and this is what Lance Sergeant Bob Folds said. We fired something like 600 rounds a gun before breakfast. That was our all-time record. We were all pretty shattered. The gun barrels were glowing red. I don't think I've ever seen them so hot. As you put the charge in and closed the breech, the gun went off. There was no question of pulling the trigger. Whoa, sounds dangerous to me. Now, the Black Watch start to move forward, and with them go the mobile OP team of 425 Battery, and that means Lance Bombardier Ted Whittaker. So, what's the final words of advice?
We brewed up. Peter said, "Now you all know what you're going to do." Poured a rather large rum ration into all our drinks, and off we went.
That Peter is Peter Birkin, Major Peter Birkin, the commander of 42 Bat 5 Battery, and one of the great heroes of the South Notts throughout the campaign. Now, Frank Penlington, who was a miserable bugger, sorry to any of his relatives listening to this, but he was given the task of driving Bombardier Stan Keaton's 1,500 weight truck as it accompanied Peter Birkin and Whittaker's Bren carrier. Now, Bren carrier armour is shit. But Frank Penlington was not happy. So what's Frank whining on about?
We should have had a tracked vehicle. Nobody said to me, "You're going to go with the infantry, the Black Watch in the first wave." Dawn hadn't broken. I was in the front on the start line. The Sergeant Major of the Black Watch says, "Where's your mugs, lads? I thought we were having tea." All the lads had got their mugs and he filled it up with rum. I sipped mine just to wet my lips. Yeah. We just went forward. There were 3 signallers in the back, reeling out the line, going at 4 miles an hour, and if that, very slow. All hell blew loose. Nothing but shell bursts, black plumes, bullets coming towards me. As we laid it out, they blew it up. It was a waste of time. 5 of us risking our lives for nothing.
Well, there would have been signals repairing the line behind them, actually, but it is a terribly dangerous job, and I'm not sure they thought it through. Notice he'd completely forgotten his briefing, and if he did, he had been told what he was doing. He just forgot. Now, the OP Bren carrier goes through the gap in the barbed wire defences and then across the tank trap that had already been filled in into no man's land. Peter Birkin, Major Peter Birkin, he's in the back of the Bren carrier, and Ted Whittaker and the driver were in front. Birkin was meant to rendezvous with the colonel of the Black Watch, 2nd Black Watch, and this is Lieutenant Colonel George Rusk, who seems to be a right manly sort. And they were to basically assess their progress, and then as an OP, they could call down further artillery bombardments as required by the infantry. So, Lance Bombardier Ted Whittaker, give me your all.
There was the most incredible noise I've never known in my life, before or since, heard anything like it. For some minutes it was impossible. There was our barrage, people firing back, tanks, trucks. In the middle of all this, a Black Watch piper standing there. We couldn't hear a thing, but he was stood there with these pipes. Shortly after that, we met Colonel Rusk, and again, I was absolutely flabbergasted. There stands this colonel, stood there with his greatcoat, steel helmet, and a proper ash walking stick with a knob on top. "Morning, Peter." We set off, constantly checking that we were on right line. The tanks ran into a minefield, so that was the tanks gone. This was horrifying because we were going to follow them. German machine guns sounded just like a piece of calico tearing. They seemed to fire 10 times as fast as ours. Now, they eventually get to Tiger, and Ted Whittaker goes on to say, "The most miserable little selection of holes and things you've ever seen." That was Tiger. I got a message just after we got there. A voice told me it was Brigade HQ and said, "Report your position." I very proudly said, "Tiger." Repeat, Tiger.
So that fell at, 10:15, I think. But there's still danger. So what do they come under fire from? And this is quite dramatic.
Yeah, they come under fire from the multi-purpose German 88mm guns. And Lance Bombardier Ted Whittaker says, "These were firing at close range. And after the first few shots, everyone's expression was, 'Christ almighty, what's that?' There were 2 bangs. The second one you heard was the gun going off. The shell was so fast, I think it was almost supersonic. You'd hear an enormous bang as the shell burst close to you. Then the next bang was safe. As someone said, if you hear the second bang, you're still alive."
So the second bang was the sound of the gun firing. Wow. So that's 425 Battery and their OP post and their very unhappy signal, the wire laying team. 426 battery at first have a slightly quieter time because actually the Black Watch take their objective as well. They take but then the next strong point is called Tugan. You know for a fact it's pronounced that way.
Yes.
And that lay between them. That's the next one between them and the El Dudade Ridge. Which was strongly held, and the resistance is all the time beginning to stiffen. Classic German or Italian, they will get, as you go further, it's going to get harder, Gary. By the time Tugan fell, that was 1537. We're not going into that. It was obvious that 70th Division isn't going to be able to smash its way through to El Duda. Sorry.
That serves you right.
It does serve me right. El Duda
Ridge.
El Duda Ridge, I think is how you really pronounce it. And of course, but hopefully everything's going all right with 8th Army. Nope, because that's stalled as well. Why? Why might it have stalled, Gary?
Well, I think largely because the Germans were in defensive positions, and as we well know, the Germans in defensive positions, pretty bloody hard to shift, frankly. Very, very strong positions. And, of course, you got the British failure to combine the armour and the infantry and artillery into a single, well-directed punch. Not a hook, a punch, Pete.
And so you're saying they're slightly isolated
attack.
Yeah,
so you're getting quite painful losses in the face of a determined resistance.
And did the Germans do their favourite defensive tactic?
I presume you're referring to counter-attacks. Yes, you've got counter-attacks by the 15th and 21st Panzer Divisions on the key Sidi Rezai Ridge.
And Sidi Rezai is the one before El Dudade Ridge.
El Dudade.
I'm not going to call it. I'm just going to call it that for the rest of the podcast and pretend that I know the name better than anyone else. Sorry about this. It's a first challenge, really. Well, not first, but the German Mark III and IV Panzer tanks are meeting our General Stuart, our Stuart and Crusader tanks. And how do you think they're doing? I'm not sure. I think basically the Mark IIIs and IVs are still slightly better. Well, they're better than the Honeys. We call the Stuart's Honeys and the Crusader. What do you think?
Well, they had an edge in firepower, but we mentioned them earlier. There's also deadly batteries of the 50mm Pak 38 and the 88mm gun. You cannot underestimate the effectiveness of those 88s.
So that leaves, what happens there is, because they haven't got through to El Dudar Ridge on one side, that's because they haven't got through it from Tobruk either. What happens is that 426 battery is left in a sort of corridor, strung out, so sort of reaching towards El Dudar Ridge. And they're sort of reaching out, and there's people all around them. And this is Lance Bombardier Albert Swinton, who we'd got Germans on three sides and got hammered something rotten. We're being shelled and all sorts. It was right touchy place. Shells flying all over the place. The Padre came round, and he was a big fat man, Parry. He'd got a little tiny hat on the top of his head. He was walking round in amongst all this lot saying, "Have faith, my boys." We used to say to him, "Why don't you F off, you silly old sod? Have faith, my boys." You've got to admire the man, because he was a hell of a target. Now that is the humour of the arm. He was a hell of a target. He was referring to his obesity. No. I remember when you were a hell of a target, but now you've young, slimmed down, Gary.
Have faith, Pete.
Have faith. Now, Snedson isn't deaf to... people often say, some of us are atheists, some of us aren't. But Swinton says this about the sort of message Padre Parry. When, in his serious moment, he said, "You can talk to who you like, but there's no atheist on the battlefield," says Swinton. "I could say that in all sincerity. I've known blokes say, 'Nope, I've got no time for religion.' You put them in a battle and they're all there praying, mate. There are no atheists on a battlefield." And I think that's true of most atheists. I think it's called That business...
Hedging your bets.
Hedging your bets. Thank you. You recognise I'd completely forgotten the words for that. Anyway, what happens next? They've got shell holes landing all round the gun positions. But they were lucky. They were lucky. And they were lucky because in those circumstances, they're supporting the infantry. So what's the basic principle of the gunners? We've talked about this before. If the gunners are supporting the infantry and they come under fire, they've got to carry on. Got to carry on. This is what Lance Bombardier Albert Swinton says. There was no backing down and getting under cover because you're being shelled. Come what may, you've got a programme and you've got to do it. Them blokes in front are relying on you to put this barrage in front of them so that they can keep up at the back of it. Or if they're attacking a post and they want covering fire, you've got to do it.
I notice you've slipped into an accent there. I didn't know that Swinton was...
Well,
I thought it was Welsh, to be honest.
It's better than your Geordie accent. That was actually a Chesterfield accent.
All right.
The situation starts to deteriorate, and both 425, 426 battery are firing as fast as they can. And it's man and machine being pushed to the limits of their endurance. And you're going to... Lance Sergeant George Pearson, aren't you, this time? Tell us, George, what's happening?
The Germans put in a heavy attack, and the OP, who thought he was going to be overrun, just gave the quite unconventional order, and fire like bloody hell. The wireless set went dead, and we went to town. We got rid of the whole 240 rounds behind the gun. We were engaged by counter-battery fire. Some rotten German was firing back at us, most unsporting. The excitement of firing was a distraction. Your guns were making a noise. Your neighbour's gun is banging off as well. So the noise you were making distracts from the explosion of shells on your position. I clocked my gun firing off between 12 and 13 rounds a minute. My gun was just beginning to glow red round the jacket, the thicker part that goes round the barrel. That was very dangerous.
That's the business of this started firing off as soon as you put the shells in without pulling the lanyard. Now, I love the next bit because the battle, the Crusader operations, they're just incredibly complicated, Gary. Perhaps you'd like to explain them for me now, just in a few sentences.
Yeah, the official historian... he himself despairs of describing the situation, and he says, the forces of both sides were sandwiched like layers of a Neapolitan ice.
I'd like to go into more detail, Gary, perhaps?
No, I think you'll find that when authors use terms such as Neapolitan ice, it's because they don't want to go into any detail.
Because they've no idea what's
Absolutely
happening.
No idea how to explain it.
It is phenomenal. Look, I'm sure that people like Gareth Davis, Mr. Tank, people like that will understand what's going on.
Chris Carling.
Major Chris Carling will understand. He understands any military situation.
He'll understand. He'll explain.
We ought to perhaps describe Major Chris Carling, a small man, I would say, in many ways.
Big in stature.
But big in stature, yes. A man who has led from the front and from behind.
At this point, Chris, you'll notice I am saying absolutely nothing.
Anyway, so it is just incredibly complicated, and we're going to sketch it out. So the 8th Army seems to be teetering on the brink of defeat. It really seems that they're going to lose the battle, but Auchinleck is the hero because Andrew Cunningham is shaken, the commander of 8th Army. He's teetering as well. It's not just his army, he is. And Auchinleck recognises this and intervenes and stops Cunningham from retreating, giving up the offensive and going back to the Egyptian border. Because Auchinleck realises Rommel must be suffering casualties because the fighting's severe. His supply situation has got to be dire. His supply chain's going all the way back to bugger knows where, but it's nowhere near. And he's got the revitalised Tobruk garrison lurking behind his lines, threatening those supply lines. So,
and bugger knows where is even further than El Dudar Ridge.
It's a lot further to the west than El Dudar Ridge. Well spotted. Past Tobruk and way on to, I can't remember the name of the sodding port. And it's not going to come back to me just at the moment.
It will later.
It will, yes. It's in Tunisia. Is it Tunis? I don't know. Anyway, 24th of November, Rommel, and this is weird, he decides he's overcome the British armoured strength and he launches this weird attack. he sends the Afrika Korps Panzer Division charging down a sort of desert track, the Trig El Abad track, raiding into Egypt, attempting to cut through the logistical supply routes to 13th Corps. Now, this is known by proper historians, as opposed to half-witted idiots like me and you, or me anyway, as the dash for the wire. And it's a bit bold, do you not think? Careening around.
It doesn't take into account, for example, the advance of 2nd New Zealand Division.
Because they're pushing on Sidi Rezaiq, aren't they?
And in some ways it's a bit of a relief, I think, for the British forces, because it gives them some recovery time.
I think so, and it doesn't achieve anything. He was a bit unlucky. He fails to find any of the forward British supply bases, which is quite lucky. He also triggers a dismissal of Cunningham. Andrew Cunningham's sacked, and he's replaced by Lieutenant General Neil Ritchie. Auchinleck is a stern taskmaster, and he then swings. Rommel swings across to Bardia. Then he falls back, counterattacks at Sidi Rezaiq. This is all. This is the Neapolitan ice cream. They're all mixed up like 3 sausages of different
like
size.
Neapolitan ice cream.
Like Neapolitan ice cream. Not forget the sausages. Let's stick to the Neapolitans.
Let's stick to that.
And the New Zealand Division, 2nd New Zealand Division, they're pushing on the night of 26th November. And they send out a battalion, and it reaches out, and it meets the 70th Division, which has just about managed to reach El Dudar Day Ridge, as you call it. I'm just trying to switch responsibility now. And they get on the morning of the 27th of November. Now, the South Notts Hussars have a fantastic idea of this, because when the New Zealanders come in, this is what Lance Sergeant Bob Volz said. We woke up one morning to see a line of trucks which said 8th Army. They were coming in, and it was the New Zealanders. Somebody said to the leading officer or NCO, "Thank goodness you've come," and Tobruk's relieved. They said, "Relieved nothing. We've been chased in by the Germans." And this is triggered by the fact that Rommel has once again counterattacked, and he briefly severed the links between El Dudar and Sidi Rezaiq ridges. Now, if you don't understand what's going on here, when you read my book at close range, you'll see that I never really understood it either. I'm not bloody pretending to. Anybody who has any questions about this phase in the fighting, would they please address them to Gareth Davies on Twitter or Facebook, and he will give you a detailed resume of what's happening. Thank you, Gareth. He's a good friend of ours, isn't he? Tanky.
He was.
Yes, he was. There's considerable amusement at times, because what do you imagine that the South Notts Hussars, how do they, when they've thought about it, when they've met these New Zealanders, how do you think they present this?
Well, they would have claimed that they relieved the 8th Army, who was stranded in the desert.
We've rescued you, 8th Army. Yes, I love it. The fighting rages on. And again, we're cutting this all out. What is the difference between the two sides? The biggest difference between side A, the British, the Allied forces, and side B, the Germans and Italians. What's the big difference? We're not talking about fighting quality. What's the difference?
They speak different languages.
Correct. And the other difference...
Well, for one thing, Rommel couldn't really replace any of his troops. He did not have reserves.
So his troops are in continuous action, and do you think they might be getting tidy?
Yeah.
And worn down?
Yeah, and fairly quickly, I would have thought.
Worn down and worn out. And there's fuel problems. You go for a dash for the wire, fuel. There's all sorts of severe problems. But Auchinleck isn't suffering from quite the same problems. I mean, the fighting's been severe, but he's held his nerve. Can he move up reserves?
Yeah, I mean, he's on his supply lines. I mean, this is typically a battle of attrition, and Rommel can't win it.
He can't win it. Of course he can't, because he's right at the end of it. Absolutely. And so, in the end, what happens? Well, 4th of December, Rommel tries to take El Dudar Ridge again. He's repulsed by the 70th Division. He's supplied... I'm going to use the technical term. He's buggered. His supply situation is dreadful. He abandons the eastern perimeter of Tobruk, to face, and the forces turn to face the 13th Corps. You get the idea of how complicated it is, because that means they've got their back to the Tobruk garrison. On 5th of December, he gives up and retreats to secure his supply lines. And they're basically hustled out of that area, Saraneka. They retreat all the way back to defensive lines, which are anchored at Gazala, which I don't think is the place I was thinking of. I'm bloody certain it wasn't. 15th of December, 8th Army begin a frontal attack, and they force them all the way back to El Aguila, right back to where they'd started off in February 1941. It's the crude expression which Matt McLachlan would use is like a horse draws. I believe that's the Australian expression.
Nat McLachlan.
Yes, we do call him Nat now occasionally, because he's expressed a fondness for that different first name. You may notice the South Notts Hussars haven't featured much in this, but the siege of Tobruk is over. Operation Crusader is, in my view, a victory. It's often ignored, but it's a crucially important part of the Desert War. It really does matter. And in the end, although it was terrible fighting, although things went wrong all the time, I think Auchinleck, do you not think, deserves credit for keeping his nerve? What do you think?
Yeah, I think not only that, I mean, let's face it, this was against a major German army. And it's really the first time in the Second World War that we've defeated a major German army in the field.
And I think he keeps his focus, doesn't he? So you've got Rommel flailing about and arsing here, there and everywhere with the dash for the war. But Auchinleck keeps his focus. And I think, because it's in the end, all Rommel's fancy manoeuvring is pretty pointless compared to the application of force to the key point, which is what old traditional military virtues, as espoused by yourself. If you wanted to go to the bar when you were a soldier, you would get to that bar, wouldn't you?
Yes, Peter. Or I'd ask somebody else to go.
Yeah. I think you'll find that Auchinleck asked the 13th and 30th Corps to go for him. I think we should. It's a more important battle than and Operation Crusader is interesting and should be studied more. And I know that there's a specialist group that are studying it. There's loads of people who've expressed interest in it, and I look forward to having it explained so that a moron like myself can understand it a bit better. Now, the men of 107th, what state are they in? Do you think after the siege?
Well, they're going to be physically exhausted, but also they're going to be mentally exhausted. It's been pretty horrific, I think, is how you would describe it. The losses in Crusader, certainly in tanks, were huge in the first few days. So they're going to be shot to pieces, frankly.
So they're
and let's bear in mind, this isn't just Crusader. They've been there 8 months, I think, by this stage.
Our maths is not good, but they certainly got there in April. And no, I'm not going to attempt to work that out.
I can count to 8.
Can you? Blimey.
With help.
So here's a quote from Lance Sergeant Ray Ellis, always a favourite of ours, isn't he, Gary? And this is how does he express his feelings at the end of the siege?
There were no great celebrations or parties. We were too tired and weary for that. There was a great feeling of relief that it was over, because until that moment we didn't know that Tobruk was going to be relieved. We didn't know that we were going to win any battle. All the time we were in Tobruk, there was always a constant fear that we would be overcome and taken.
Incredible mental stress. At any moment they could be killed by a shell landing on them. It's a bit like Gallipoli in that. They were never safe and couldn't be safe. Now, they move westward behind the general advance, but they run out of petrol and they stop at Timony, which is just an obscure place. Basically, they're in a bare patch of desert. They give their vehicles and guns to other artillery units, and they cease for the moment to be a fighting regiment. They're just a group of men. Now they do celebrate, and this is to bring the end to this podcast. We're going to talk about the celebrate. They do have an impromptu party. Now, there's lots of versions as to where they got the alcohol from. But this is Lance Bombardier Albert Swinton's version. I think it catches the spirit of how they just got booze from any bloody where. Do you think it was high quality booze in the desert? Yeah. Well, obviously. Yeah. Anyway, Swinton says this. Ivor Birkin, that's Captain Ivor Birkin, one of the Birkin family, he would say, there's a truck, there's two blokes, off you go, find something to drink. A bit like you when you were... Yeah, sorry. Never mind about where you get it. Go and find it, buy it, pinch it, do what you like, but get back here with something to drink. On this occasion, they came back with some horrible, purple-looking Italian wine in 44-gallon drums. The sort of wallop where the first mouthful tasted of potash or something, but after a couple of mugs, it tasted all right. They build a huge bonfire and 3 sheep are purchased for an Arab for £0.5 of tea. Purchased. Do you think they threw the £0.5 of tea after stealing the sheep?
Yeah.
Anyway, you're going to be Lance Sergeant George Pearson and tell how the party develops.
The cooks cooked up this sheep and then we settled into this Chianti. We were all well and truly plastered. The troop sergeant major was sat astride this barrel of Chianti, ladling it out in mugs. We only had 2 non-drinkers in the troop, and they had a stretcher. As fast as people folded over and passed out, they put them on this stretcher and carried them back to their vehicle. It was a paralytic night. Now,
they had a bit of a sing-song, and it's great. I just love this next quote, and this is from Lance Sergeant Bob Falls, and it shows how the musicianship, the standard of musicianship deteriorates. Now, I'm in a punk band, and I can assure you the standard of our musicianship deteriorates as we get drunk and our ability to remember lyrics. This is this is Bob Folds. We had a bloke who played the piano accordion. He played all night, and gradually his playing got wilder and wilder as he got drunker and drunker, until eventually it came to a great last chord, and he collapsed. Now, one of those who fell hors de combat in this terrible battle with 44 gallons of Chianti. There's other stories where it's Italian bread. There's all sorts of stories, but one of those who fell hors de combat was Bombardier Albert Parker. And I can almost feel you inhabiting the persona of Albert.
Bombardier Albert Parker. I got gloriously drunk and I went outside. I don't know whether you've had a lot of wine to drink, but if you get out in the fresh air, it tends to make you keel over. Jack Billington said to the others, Parker's outside, I think he's dead. I kicked him twice and he never moved. Next morning, when I got up, all my ribs were bruised. I felt rough, really rough.
You've never felt like that, have you? No. Now, Ray Ellis had only just been promoted to Lance Sergeant, and I don't know whether it was because Ray used to like a drink, but he's a voice of reason and calm here, isn't he?
Yeah, I think it was doomed to failure from the start, but Lance Sergeant Ray Ellis says, it occurred to me what was happening, so I went and got Sergeant Frank Birkinshaw and said, Frank, stop drinking. Everyone's going to get paralytic. We'd better stay sober. It was no use telling everyone to stay sober. The men were not in the mood to be told to stop drinking. Now, he's relatively sober, and from this relatively sober viewpoint, he's got a good perspective of what's going to happen as the evening wears on. So he goes on to say, it was amazing because every man went through the same changes as they got drunk. They were happy for a start. Everyone was laughing and happy. It relieved all the tensions. We were out of Tobruk. Backslapping, weak jokes were laughed at. All the normal things of men getting drunk. Gradually it changed, and they stopped laughing and become maudlin. It was mothers, sweethearts and wives. Tears rolling down. Then eventually they just collapsed unconscious, dropped down onto the ground. Frank and I went round all the gun towers collecting blankets and covering them, because it was bitterly cold and they could have died of exposure.
Desert at night in December, yes, freezing cold. Now, What often happens after a spell of heroic drinking, as we call it, Gary? What is a common result?
Well, you you usually find that when you're at your worst hangover, somebody wants you to do something, usually quite important.
Now, is that bitter experience for you from your days at Transport for London after going out for a drink with Historians Do Drink, the august Facebook group that we're both members of?
Oh, I thought I was either a historian or a doer. I didn't ever drink.
Well, that's a fib. Have you ever seen that picture of you and me in the tube station? Leaning on the wall.
Anyway, as often is the case, come the dawn, the men would regret the heroic inebriations of the night before, and on the 30th of December 1941, the South Notts Hussars are recalled to Cairo.
Suddenly.
And Lance Sergeant George Pearson says, next morning we had the news that we were being withdrawn and going back to Cairo for rest, re-equipment and leave. We travelled in the quad gun towers with blinding thick heads over a bumpy desert. We paid dearly for our night before, believe me.
Those towers are still towers. Oh, it's so nice for you to mispronounce them. I have to say, there is no difference in how the words are spelled. I pity the lads. Can you imagine the nature of that hangover? What they'd been drinking. No, and remember, not much water to slake their... it must have been so awful. Now, during the siege of Tobruk, on a serious note, I don't know why you're so flippant at times, Gary, and I really feel you should be.
I stand admonished.
The regiment had fired some 70,000 shells, and they were a vital ingredient in the defence of Tobruk, particularly in those early days when they and the Australians and the other artillery units they'd managed to hold back concerted attacks. It was a notable achievement, but it was painful. They'd suffered 19 dead, 37 wounded. Again, people say, well, that's not many.
It's to the families concerned.
It's enough. Most of them had survived, and there's a view, and when we were interviewing them, when you read some of the memoirs, there's this view that they'd suffered the worst. They'd been to Tobruk. It was the worst that the war could throw at them. What could happen that would be worse than the siege of Tobruk? Well, we'll find out in the next episode of our podcasts. The next South Notts Hussars episode, when we come to the Battle of Knightsbridge, which is an awful affair. A bit of advertising. Some of you may know my book, At Close Range, Life and Death in an Artillery Regiment at War, 1939-45. It's like a Band of Brothers type tale. It's just what you've been listening to. At the moment, the only version available is the audio version, and that's great. I think I'd love you to buy that. But the printed version will be out, relatively soon. That'll be out in December, January 2021.
You were going to say January 1941, weren't you?
I was going to say that because we've been talking about it. I urge you all to buy it for two reasons. One, for the memory of the lads. It's a great story of men at war. And the other, it'll massively improve my bank balance.
There is a third reason. It is a good companion to the podcast. If you're enjoying the podcasts, the book goes into a little more detail perhaps than we have time to do. And I would heartily recommend it. I have it on my bookshelf already.
Unread,
because I'm doing podcasts.
And on that delightful and very supportive note, we'll say goodbye today.
Goodbye today.